AI models will be actually so much of a competition with the colleges that it will force them to change just by incentive, because you'll be losing that like tuition revenue, or like you'll be losing the credibility of having the best people coming to you, because people will be like, hey, I can just learn this on my own. I don't need to do this. Everyone wanted to be Tony Stark. But I also think that like you will never be Tony Stark. It's like, do you want your backstory to be like, hey, I optimized for like money and returns, or I optimized for like what I thought was important, and then I invested all of the time I had into that? There's always trade-offs to things, right? And you have to like appreciate the school system is like, unfortunately or fortunately, built for like many people, but you know, you have to accept that like they're not just for you. Forcing yourself to do something that is like uncomfortable, like there's benefits to doing that. You have to choose the right thing to be uncomfortable over. The purpose of an institution like MIT is to prepare people to become engineers and use the tools that are available to them to produce things that like benefit humanity.
And so what role do you think universities like MIT will play in the near-term future?
I feel like...
So, hey, Caleb. Well, thanks for having this conversation with me.
For sure.
For everybody's context, you've probably seen him in one of my other videos where we do walk around interviews. He's probably in a lot of B-roll and a lot of shots. He's just always around our office. Like, he actually works here on his own things, but we love having him around because we just like having really smart people by the office. Dave Blendon, our general partner, calls you one of the smartest people he's ever met. And from someone who's met so many different people, I think that's really high praise. And then anyone that I introduced to you is just blown away. So
appreciate it, man.
There's my intro. But today I kind of want to get into, what brought you here today. If I'm not mistaken, you've now dropped out of MIT twice.
I have. It's going live now. So it's public.
So what happened, right? Like, tell me about your upbringing.
Yeah.
What got you to today, and then what led to that first dropout, and we can go from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm Ethiopian by birth, so that's very interesting culture, very education driven. So, I mean, getting in from, I think about sophomore year of high school, it was kind of very just like studious, and like, my parents would like get us workbooks over the summer, things like that. And it's like, I hated it. But like I realized, it benefited and it contributed to like, my technical skills and stuff now. But yeah, I figured out basically when I was like 10 or 11, Scratch, MIT.edu, great website. And it was basically like coding, but like it was like visual Legos. And I was like, ooh, I like this. This is cool. Another cool thing was that they had like a bunch of people's projects. So not only could you like do your own stuff, as you could see a bunch of people's projects, and there's like a lot of games. We were young kids. We liked to play games. And we'd see all these games. I was like, okay, look, I'm gonna make one. And then from scratch, like I picked up Python, and then I picked up a bunch of other languages, and like building little like toy.
How old were you at this time?
I think 11, 12 by the time I started like actually doing real code. And then like I remember in middle school there was like a programming club, so like I started going to that, and that was pretty fun, like learning how to code. And doing like a bunch of like little games, text games, like learning these little visual games, like nothing too crazy. I think it was like by high school was when I started doing a little more serious stuff. So I actually like it was my 10th grade like research class was like when I first got into like AI. I did like a very basic like little AI thing with like doing like neuron activations and stuff and taking a look at them. And then COVID hit. So COVID was the actual like I think big like thing that like connected everything, because it was just like I could code. And I was like, oh, I want to make money now. Like, everyone's sitting at home in COVID. I want to make money.
So how old were you when COVID hit?
I think it was like 14 or 15. Okay. It was like sophomore year of high school. And maybe I was 15. So by then, I had been like coding for a while. Like I knew how to code, and I'd been like doing all these things. So I was like, cool, I'm going to get an internship. So like I started applying to them, and I couldn't get anything. So I was like, all right, let me just like, hack my way through this. And I built this like little like, interview application bot, and I put like 2,000 applications, and I got this like one very stupid little like programming job at like a publishing company, a small publishing company in New York. And I was like doing stuff for them with their website. And like I basically like worked a bunch of small jobs like that. But that was kind of like my introduction to like doing work, like actually like writing code that was like useful to people. And that was like very interesting. So I did that during COVID. And I worked at a bunch of different jobs, and I ended up working at the startup that was doing like, video call stuff during COVID, very, very hot stuff.
Yeah.
And that was like my first like working at a startup kind of thing. And it was very interesting. It wasn't very successful, but like we had like a bunch of like interns on the team because it was a bunch of college students, and I was like the youngest guy. But I ended up like running the engineering team at the end. Like it was like a year after I was like running the engineering team, doing a bunch of different like web stuff and like video chat stuff. And at the same time, I started doing research. So I was doing like distributed systems research, specifically in Ethiopia, with like essentially the office buildings, like the Wi-Fi would get turned off for like political reasons. But you'd have an office building that was like fully interconnected. So I was like, we could use that to like, store files and like keep a network in the actual building so we could still communicate and stuff. So I was doing stuff like that in Ethiopia. And that was like my first like big real like programming project that I got to like design for myself. So like I built a small testing rig. I had like a bunch of like Raspberry Pis that I like tested stuff out on, and like writing the code for that. I remember like being at the mall like one day. I was like, all right, I'm gonna work at the mall, writing the code to the mall. And yeah, that got me into distributed systems, and from distributed systems you get crypto, and I was like, okay, crypto, nice. And also the other thing was like Ethiopia has a big currency problem, just like inflation. So like, I knew that there was things you could do with crypto and inflation. So me and buddies, like I think I'd gotten into MIT around that time that I started doing this stuff. So at Admit weekend at MIT and Caltech, I like met people and we were talking about it, and we started hacking, like literally during Admit weekend. And we kept working on it. And then I think we worked on it, and that summer we like left, we moved to like say like Missouri and like San Francisco to like work on this project. And then we went to like school that fall, and like we had been essentially like evolved from being just like, generic crypto and, inflation stuff to specifically working with Latin American businesses to move money or like large sums of money around for like, big invoices and stuff. And we figured, yeah, we can use crypto to do this. We can reduce the exchange rate. We could also like make it more efficient so that you could do it in like hours, not like 3 weeks for international transfers.
How did you make connections at that time?
It was a bunch of cold outreach. Yeah. I mean, at that age, like I think you don't really have that much, like you don't really know that many people.
Yeah.
So it was not very efficient, but we did a lot of cold outreach. But like it was nice too to be within even the MIT community at that point was super helpful. So we ended up meeting with this like MIT like Sloaney, who like used to work in like some sort of like he was a VC or something who worked with a bunch of these like exchanges. So he hooked us up in Brazil and like got us talking with some people. So yeah, and that was like in around summertime or whatever. And then we came to campus. I was at campus for like a month and a half or something, Baker, One West, you know how it is. And then, yeah, I remember it was a 3091, a chemistry, solid state chemistry. I was exam number 2. And I was working on it, and I think we were like already about to fundraise at that point, or we were about to or something. And I looked at like I hadn't gone to class, so I had like 115 pages of just like class notes. I was like, and I was getting ready to like cram the night before, and I looked at this and I was like, I don't have to do this. And like that was the day. I was like, all right, cool. And then just stopped going to class. Spent more time working, and then yeah, I dropped out the first time.
And when you dropped out immediately, did you just start working on this crypto thing?
Well, we'd been working on it for a while, and we'd been talking with a bunch of people. So there was this one company in San Francisco that was doing like crypto like banking style stuff, and they were basically wanting to like acquire us.
Okay.
So like by that point, we kind of knew that was going to happen. So I was like, all right, like
where were you able to work out of at the time?
My dorm, my dorm, like the lounge outside of it. Yeah, for the most part, that's what I did. I don't really remember working anywhere else. Yeah.
And did they kick you off campus right away? Or?
No. They didn't even know. It's the thing, right? Because like it was the middle of the semester.
Gotcha.
It was just like, oh, I just stopped showing up to class. Yep. Like, so I was just.
So you like mentally dropped out, but you didn't hand in anything.
Yeah, no. I dropped. Like I think I like actually dropped out, but like when I was in San Francisco, so I was like sitting on a couch in the office, and then I got an email from like my advisor, and they're like, "Yo, where are you?" And I was like, "Oh, by the way," and then they're like, "What's up?" And then yeah, so that was when I like technically dropped out, like literally.
So how long did it take you to get to San Francisco?
I think within a week.
Oh.
I was like, yeah. So they were like, yeah. I was like, all right, my co-founder, he was at Columbia. He stayed to finish the semester. I was like, look, there's no really point in like staying to like I don't really care about chemistry and like whatever. So I was like pretty much checked out at that point. And yeah, I was like, cool, let's just start working out what's important. So I did.
Okay, so let's set the timeline now. What year, what age, and now what's your, I guess, outlook looking for the next 12 months in that point in time?
Yeah. So I was 18. This was like October 2022. It was very funny because this was like our main strategy was like, cool, let's figure out how to route transfers from like Brazilian banks to the exchange's Brazilian banks, convert it into crypto using the bank as an on-ramp, do some stuff over the network, bring the currency back down, whatever target country, and then, do something else and then turn it into a real currency again. And this was like right around when FTX happened. So FTX happened in November. So we had just, signed on the dotted line, started working on the stuff. Like that was like, the company was doing like full crypto stuff. We were doing exchange stuff. So we had just about checked out of that when the whole FTX collapse happened. I remember I was in San Francisco watching my friend trade Solana, like as this was happening, just going like, wow, like we missed that by like a little way here. So yeah, I spent about a year at that company working on building their core like on-chain infrastructure, like wallet security, cryptography, stuff like that, working with their libraries. And then I left the acquirer there after a year. So then I started doing a bunch of like different like consulting. Like I was working with one of my mentors doing like a VC. I was doing a bunch of investing in like small early stage companies. Just like I was in San Francisco, doing the thing, meeting people, talking to people, building things. And then I think in October of like 2023, I moved to New York. And that was, October 2023. I did more like crypto stuff then. I was only for like a couple months. New York wasn't really my vibe.
Yeah.
Very different community.
If you don't mind me asking, what was your money situation in San Francisco?
Yeah. So like we had an acquisition. It was like, in the 7-figure range, but it was like cash and equity.
Yeah.
So like, I did leave a lot of equity on the table. I mean, I think you have to just like take your gut and you can't just be like locked in with like money,
naturally.
right? So yeah, it wasn't working out the way I thought it would. And then I was like, cool, I value my time. So that I left a lot of equity on the table, but like I think we were like, I wasn't too strapped for cash, but I was like,
Yeah. And I ask more so because it's a situation that not too many people go through. Like you're 18, like you don't really, you can work where you want, basically. Did it change your mindset at all? Or are you just always just, hey, I want to build?
Yeah, I think I was one more billable. I think the thing was like, I think my time, like it's like I guess the best parallel is like a superhero backstory. It's like, do you want your backstory to be like, hey, I optimized for like money and returns, or I optimized for like what I thought was important, and then I invested all the time I had into that. So I like to max out my time, I think, focus on whatever is important. I think it's good to like hedge somewhat, but not to the point that like it's a significant amount of your time.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Yeah. So now you're in New York. From our conversations, you didn't really like it that much. Why?
Well, I mean, it was very convenient. I think that was the thing. Like, it was like, you can go anywhere for like $2, just get on the subway and like you have the entire city to you. And yeah, I think the builder community was a little bit different. I think, for the love of the game, like that wasn't there as much in New York. And there's a lot of crypto people that were like that, I think.
Dive into that a little bit more.
Crypto opportunists is what I would kind of describe it as. And it's like career people who come out and they're like, oh, I'm going to do crypto. And it's like, and they don't really have a good backing, or they think it's like monetarily driven. And like, I guess money can be a reason to do something, but it can't be the only reason, right? Because you have to really believe in the underlying solution, and you can't just solve a thing for the sake of just like, oh, this is the hot thing at the time. So I did I got into crypto doing like distributed systems work. So I was like, okay, like this makes sense, doing what's it called, inflationary work. So I was like, okay, like this is a very clear like benefit, what's it called, a positive effect to like benefit people. And then when I saw the industry wasn't really moving that way, I kind of got disillusioned with it, and I was like, all right, well, time to look at the next thing.
Yeah. So how long was that New York stint?
So it was okay. This is a very funny story. I think I got there by October, and I had moved out by February. And the very lucky thing that happened in like right before I moved out there's a very big thunderstorm in New York, and for one reason or another, there was like a very like brown spot in my roof, and I was like, wow, why is this so disgusting? And one day it just like collapsed, and like that it came down. So I got to get out of my lease, a 1-year lease I had signed. I got out of that very nicely. I still haven't got my security deposit back, but I got out of that lease, yeah. And then yeah, just I literally I got a U-Haul. Like I took the train to New Jersey, got a U-Haul, drove the U-Haul through Manhattan traffic at like what 8 or something. Put all my stuff into the truck, left around like 10, and got home at like 2 or 3 in the morning, and like that. Or like maybe it was like 4 or 5 even. I took a rest stop.
And so where's home at this point?
Home is Maryland. Home's Maryland.
Okay.
Families grew up in Maryland. Go Terps. So yeah, took everything. Just like was like cool. And then like that day at 12 o'clock, flight to SF. I was like, great. Now we're back in San Francisco.
Okay. And so what happened between then and coming back to MIT?
Yeah. So that was February. So I stayed in San Francisco. I worked with a bunch of my friends, just building stuff with them, building different companies. Like I worked on different AI, OCR startups for doing looking at like back office type work, understanding what like invoicing is, and working with distributors, the entire process. So I learned a lot of like good business stuff. Went out to actually meet customers. I remember like we were like meeting this big distributor out in Berkeley that we had to do one time, where it's like they were using these like old like 1980 IBM machines. We had to like set up like Raspberry Pis on their network to like connect and like input information, like that kind of stuff. Like it was very, very interesting, crafty kind of work. Doing more investing with my mentor. Yeah, that was basically San Francisco.
Okay.
Oh yeah, and then summer I went home, and I was like, I hung out with my family I hadn't seen them in a while, so hung out with them for a couple months, and then it was right before I went home that I decided, like, you know what, I wanted to focus more on like harder technical problems, specifically around AI, and I was like, okay, I'll just where's the best place to do that? The toot. So I came back around then.
Okay. And I guess we'll get into your views on school in a little bit.
Sure.
But how long did this MIT stint last? Like
basically a year.
Happened?
Yeah, a year, half a year, something like that.
What was mentally stimulating for you during that time, and what kind of pushed you away ultimately?
I think the environment was very stimulating. I feel like it is very important to be around people who are like smarter than you. Or like, okay, the way I kind of frame it is like they've invested their tech tree points in a deeper direction. So they're like, their tech tree is like deeper than yours in certain things.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of like pick up on what their failures were, what they kind of succeeded on, and like how to spend time. And that was super important to me. And the other thing was, it's just like, I think being in an environment where learning was kind of the number one thing, and not necessarily like capitalizing off learning, was another really important thing. I think that like, in San Francisco, and like it's not a bad thing. It's just like it's derivative of or emergent from the kind of incentives there. It's like everything's kind of commercialized. So I want to take a step back, and I think the other point was that like I didn't really know that much about AI. Or I know a lot less than I do now. Let's just say. So I felt like it's important to kind of give yourself some breathing room to kind of be okay with not knowing things, so that you can get to a point where you know things. So yeah, I spent a lot of time here, just like basically like especially during weekends, I would like camp out somewhere for the weekend, bring a bunch of energy drinks, and then like focus on a project. I'm like, all right, I just got to do one thing this weekend, and I got to get one thing done. I'm going to learn something, but like the point is to get something like a product out, and it doesn't need to be something crazy. Like I remember I built like a just-in-time compiler for some like obscure simple programming language. And I was like, cool, like I did it, like I know how it worked. I'd worked on like an operating system that summer. So like expanding it, adding like tools, like I remember building like a GP2 and like, shout out SF Compute for giving me H100s, they were goated. Yeah, I did that. And then like building out different, like working with BitNet, like all these different ideas that I would see, like especially getting into Twitter. And like getting research ideas from them, and then trying to distill it into something you could do in a weekend. And then also just like spending time, like having the discipline to read through things fully. I think it's like, it is scary to not know things. I think, especially when you think of yourself as like an intelligent person, it can be very scary to like sit with something that you have like no idea about, and then like actually like get through it and like accept that like, hey, like you have no idea what you're doing here.
Yeah.
But it's important to like actually sit through it, because then you get to, once you're done with all of that, like now you know something and I can go do things with that, right? So like I remember it was like I wanted to get through that 309 chemistry class partially because I was like, look, I set that down, but like I want to be able to like be like, okay, look, I learned about chemistry. And it was important too, because like learning about like building chips is about like a lot of solid state chemistry, and understanding different processes there. So like learning about the physics about the world as well, kind of getting a good first principles base, I think was super important. Now like the disillusionment kind of came when I was like, it was a very good thing that kickstarted a lot of those things for me. But at a certain point, I started realizing what the actual like methods were to do things. So then I started doing them myself. And I would like, remember like IAP, I would like get a textbook on like chip design. And I like did the whole thing. I read the whole textbook. I was like, cool, I understand this now.
Yeah.
And then when I did the class, I was like, wow, there's not really that much difference between what I thought I was doing and the thing that I actually got out of it. And I started doing more things like that. Like I remember reading like a deep learning textbook and like looking at the class on like courseware or like the recorded version of it. And I was like, yeah, there's not that much difference. So at that point I was like, okay, like I can do things. I figured out what a general like MIT technique is, which is just like, and I mean, I think also it's not necessarily always optimal. I think like a lot of these classes were designed pre-AI. So you're not necessarily using the full tools to your advantage to like get the maximum amount of learning out. So I was like, cool. Like I figured it out kind of enough to like be confident that like I could do certain things. And I was like, great, all right, let's push more. And then I got into, also the other thing was because I was like so focused on getting into like first principles understanding, physics and whatnot, I wanted to get more into hardware. So like I started learning about like chips, what kind of chips there were, how they worked, how to orchestrate like large data centers of chips, things like that. So yeah, once I was once I was confident enough about like my ability to kind of grow, then I kind of took a little bit of a step back from doing that to focus more on doing self-learning.
Yeah, I think I remember that day where you just were like, hey, I had an exam today and I just didn't go.
Yeah.
And so was that a similar 3091 situation there?
Kind of, yeah. I think the difference was like I had no clue what the 3091 exam was for, but like I knew that like if I went to that exam, I would have passed and I would have gotten a pretty good grade. So I was like a little bit less worried. But yeah, I think, yeah.
Okay. So now like I want to dive into the school aspect of things. And I guess my viewers know that I dropped out of Stanford.
Yeah.
But I went through all the undergrad here.
Yeah.
And for me, a lot of the motivations, I guess it's similar in the way where I was doing graduate work in autonomous systems, aerospace. But then at this point, I was already, 6 months into founding my own autonomous drone company.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm already building the thing that like the end project is supposed to to produce over here. And then this was my COVID year.
Yeah.
So that was the COVID year hit me on graduation for undergrad and then starting for grad school.
Right.
And they finessed me. I thought they were saying, hey, like, professors are going to be there. Facilities will be open, especially for grad students. Like you can get in. So I got this nice Palo Alto apartment.
Nice.
I also had a dorm on campus.
Which dorm building? EVGR?
Man, I'm already forgetting. It was one of the grad dorms.
Yeah.
It was one of the newer ones. And
the tall one?
Yeah.
Yeah, EVGR.
Okay. And so at this point, I was feeling really good. I'm working full time for multiple startups.
Right.
I have YouTube doing well. So this was actually like hey, I had my office and studio for filming like off campus. I was like an apartment and I can like live on campus. So I had this whole situation going on. But I just realized that most of my mental energy was going to basically anything but class.
Right.
And then I could do class.
Right.
It's like I've known how to do class my whole life. And so I could just kind of get through it.
Right.
But then the fulfillment wasn't there anymore.
Right.
And so like come winter break, when I got to dive more full time into these other things that I was working on, I'm like, why am I going back?
Right. It's tough. It's tough because I think, and I mean, your scenario kind of highlights it really well too, where it's like, you learn more through directed empirical observation than you do in a classroom, just by the sense that like you're optimizing towards something, right? Whether it's some sort of dopamine objective or like some sort of like actual like target thing, and which in a sense is dopamine, right? You're optimizing for a very targeted thing, so the amount of stuff you need to wade through reduces drastically to be like, okay, I need to get this done. And you only learn things that are like required for that. But like the benefit there is that like you learn way faster. So I think a lot of classes are kind of like you start from some like low knowledge base, and then like you kind of wade through this class and you learn about a lot of like various things, and then you kind of get to some objective and then you've learned it somewhat. And then when you're building things, it's just like, okay, I have a path from point A to point B, and like whatever's in between. And the other thing that's really interesting is that like you end up when you build, right, you end up learning things through the perspective of what you're building, right? So even after you've built you've built something already, like anything else you learn off of that, you're learning it relative to a very core like deep base you've attached to like understanding something you've built. So not only do you understand something, you understand all the parts like related to each other and how they work together. And this is like of course like some sort of like systems understanding. That I think is actually even more valuable than just like sitting in a class. Now, like the problem also with COVID is like, I feel like if we had like the models that we had today during COVID, right, like, it wouldn't even be even close. Like we've been way further than what we were. And that's the other kind of benefit that happened recently, where it's like, I think it was good to learn how to do things on your own without all this stuff, and then have it added on as like learning how to do it all. I mean, maybe I could be wrong, but like, I think there's a benefit to like appreciating the struggle for a bit and then now having the tools to kind of resolve some of those issues.
There's also an aspect that I was realizing in myself where, like, say I'm building a whole drone system that needs to communicate, it needs to connect to a network, it needs to run autonomously, you need to connect sensors. Yeah. And then I'm in class and then I'm already like mentally filtering out what's useless and what's not.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get out of that state. Like when they're teaching a lecture and I'm like, okay, this lecture has no application. Yeah. Right. And then for Stanford specifically, it was a big thing in my head that I just hated was you need to get their masters in their aerospace. And so like I'm taking fluids, controls, thermo, and I was like, I just took these. Right. And so you're putting me through these Zoom classes that I just took the class of. Yeah. So of course I'm not going to any recitations, going to any lectures. I'm just kind of showing up for the exams, doing fine because I already know the stuff. And then working on this actual physical system that puts things together.
I feel like, okay, so there's always trade-offs to things, right? And you have to like appreciate the school system is like, unfortunately or fortunately, built for like many people.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is one thing that I give schools a lot of slack for, but you have to accept that like they're not just for you, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's tough. And then the other thing also is that like, I think there is somewhat of a benefit sometimes to varying things. I think it is important. I feel like, especially like a lot of math stuff, I think it's very important because math is like patterns that repeat in like a lot of different ways. So it's like, especially maybe in your case you knew it. In my case, I didn't know a lot of this stuff. So especially when I had to go and relearn a lot of this stuff, especially now, like that I've gone to some of these classes, like I appreciate that, like, okay, like I paid attention sometimes in this point and that point. And I'm able to see and help visualize some of the actual math that, I'm doing. Yeah. So it's good to like get that muscle going. So yeah, and there's the other side of building where it's like, I think building young and building old are two very different things. Where building young is a search process and then building old is like an indexing process. Where it's like when you're young, you don't know that much things. You're building this like search and you're like looking through all these things. Whereas when you're much older, or like when you're experienced enough, right? You're more like searching through your own experiences to kind of pick up relevant ideas. And those are two very different muscles. And it's important to build them both. And like, I think school in a way does train that. I think it just doesn't train that directly. And if you do have a better way of doing it, I think you should at least experiment and try instead of like relying on just like school's everything. Cause I don't think it is.
Yeah. And there's definitely like I don't want to rag on school. There was definitely an aspect where, say, in high school, I take a physics class, and then I take an advanced physics class, and then I come to MIT and take another physics class, and then you get into like fluid dynamics, right? And that progression solidified it pretty well in my head. Like there were definitely moments where I'm like, okay, I know this whole lecture, right? But piecing it together in a way where you just are just hammered with exposure over and over again to the point where you just fundamentally understand it now.
Yeah.
It works. Like,
I 100% agree. Yeah.
And so I don't want to
for sure.
say that, but I guess going into the school direction, what do you think is happening to school right now in this AI age? And what do you think? A lot of my viewers are in university right now. Like, how do they kind of navigate this?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's two routes to take it. I think the one thing that you have to appreciate about school is that it is a tried and tested organization of concepts in some sort of like linear flow, right? So you can be, granted, some classes suck, but you can be granted that like the direction of a lot of classes is like probably the order you should learn things, and you can skip things or whatever and move things around sometimes, but like that is a good structure for a lot of these things. So like don't hate on like the structure of it for most classes. Like most of these classes are like online. Like there's really not that much variance between like MIT and Stanford for a lot of these things, or like, whatever other school. So that is really good. And like you can appreciate that like students have gone through this and been successful. So especially if you know nothing, then like going on YouTube and like watching a college course is like not a terrible thing to do, right? You can appreciate that. Maybe not the pace, right? I remember like you can crush through a lot of these lectures, especially if there's humans speaking, right? And I saw some sort of curated video. Like you can 2x that lecture and like crunch through it in like 20, 30 minutes, right? It shouldn't be taking that long. So you can go through that. You don't have to necessarily go to class. You should do the work also. And like you said, right, you can take that work off. You don't have to do it in school, right, is the point. Like you can just do it yourself. You can like pick up certain practice problem sets and like confirm that, hey, I actually understand this. And it's a good way of double checking. Now, you don't need to necessarily like do it in like a full test environment where you have no help and tricks or whatever, right? Those are just like tools that people use to like, make sure that groups of students aren't doing things that are wrong. You can have some like honesty with yourself and say, hey, am I really cheating or not? Or is it necessary to just memorize things rote, or is it just like, can I just have a set of things? Because if you're going to be in the same environment that you're building in, that's probably like the best way, I think, to test. You can do that. That's perfectly there. Now, if you're going to say, hey, I need a college environment or whatever, right? That's something that I might as well not agree with. But then there's also things, right? It's like some people, like their entire friend groups are in school, and like that's another reason why they stay. And it's like social thing as well as like that. And like maybe for me that wasn't the same thing, where all my friends were in San Francisco because I made a bunch of friends beforehand, or all my friends wanted to drop out anyway, so it's like they didn't really care, and I didn't really care. So there's other reasons, like maybe it's like a family reason or like a immigration reason, right? Like it doesn't make sense for everyone. But if you can do it yourself, I think I would minimize the amount of time you are wasting doing things that you don't have to do for whatever goals you have. And I think it is important to have goals. You can change them, right? But have a goal, do work towards that goal, and, you can change your goal later. But yeah.
And I think we, just before this conversation, you talked about almost just reducing your error rate moving forward. And for a lot of people, I feel like school is that avenue, right? Like they might not have the intrinsic motivation every day to kind of just stay on the straight and narrow. Right. You're in this environment where everyone's doing it. So you're like, okay, I'm going to class today. I'm going to do my work.
I mean, I don't even know if it's about staying on the straight and narrow, to be honest. I feel like the comment about like maintaining or reducing your error rate was more like, it's around the concept of like perfect practice makes perfect, right? And like you can't always be perfect, but the point is to like do things that are going to probably be good for you, right? So if building a project from scratch, if it's the first time you've done it, like that's probably going to be a good thing to do, like to learn that muscle of like, how do I start from zero and like iterate my way towards something that I'm like proud of, right? That's a really important thing because you have to do that very often. So it's like, maybe you want to like, you don't want to do everything yourself that first time. Maybe you want to like follow a couple guides, do it a couple times, try a bunch of different projects, see how that goes. And like by, working through a bunch of different points, right, you have a much better model of like what to expect the next time you're doing something, and you can reduce your error rate there. But it's like, I think discipline and staying on the straight and narrow comes from like actually caring about the goal enough and setting goals that you actually like can achieve and are doable. so that you are motivated to continue to do them. And it's not about just like forcing yourself to do something that is like uncomfortable. Like there's benefits to doing that, but like you have to choose the right thing to be uncomfortable over. Like just like spending every single day doing leak code is, I personally do not think is like a great way to like learn how to do these things. But like people will like be like, oh, it's discipline. Like you have to push yourself through this stuff, and it's not really helpful. I mean, it's helpful for some things, but not like a lot of things, you know? So that's what I kind of mean by like that. Yeah.
And so with school, how do you think school has to evolve? Say we're about to have a conversation with MIT's president.
Yeah.
What would you tell her?
I think that like, I would just basically say the purpose of an institution like MIT is to prepare people to become engineers and use the tools that are available to them to produce things that like benefit humanity. And if that is the general direction, and I could, granted, it could be something else, but if we assume that that is the direction of the school, then we must account for the tools that we have available to us through these AI models to help people have a better, stronger understanding of the more important principles of engineering, which are things like understanding how to empirically assess, like learning new skills from what already exists, taking that and applying creativity and taking new ideas and combining new ideas to do new things. And like empower people with these skills because, you know, maybe it doesn't make sense to spend your time memorizing a bunch of like real engineering principles if you can pull them up very easily whenever you need it. Or not only just pull them up, you can have a conversation about them with a being that is like contains a corpus of information that like essentially is MIT. Like you could train a model on every single MIT textbook or paper or whatever, and like you could conversate with that thing. And that probably is a much better building block for efficient understanding for most people than sitting and reading textbooks or like sitting and doing P-sets. Like that might be better. And like we should have a very open conversation about that. We should be spending more time giving people realistic projects. I think the P-sets, especially in a lot of these computer science classes, are too static for today. I think people should be more ambitious with these things. The other thing, also just like a general software engineering complaint, is just like people should be using modern tools more. I think a lot of tools that people use, and specifically in SWE classes, are not necessarily like, especially even in the earlier ones, right? A lot of people just take like, old 009 or like 1010 or something like that.
Yeah,
and like,
these are algorithms courses
and programming courses, right? And they'll just be using like the most like basic tools or whatever, and just like expand that a little bit more. And like people should be exposed with tools earlier, I think. And also I think there's this general process of like, how do I learn to use a tool that I've never seen before? I think that is a meta skill you want to teach. And you should be making people uncomfortable with that every single time. And I think the other thing is just like, I think imbue more creativity because we can now. I think LLMs can be used in a lot of ways to spur creativity by just like asking the right kind of questions to the students, and you can make that a part of the experience. Yeah, just pushing for ambition. I feel like a lot of people today, granted, there are benefits to doing this, but like they kind of get sucked up into this like, career SWE, career quant route, and they kind of just like are like money maxing, and we've kind of lost a lot of the entrepreneurial or like self-directed, ambition. And like these kids are smart, right? Obviously, they wouldn't be here if they weren't. But I feel like that's taking the easy way out. You're setting some sort of very clear objective for someone, like, hey, be good at like maxing these types of algo problems or whatever, and like you'll get a good life. And it's just not how the world works, So like setting these because I remember even the career fair. This would piss me off. At the career fair, there was an entire gym just for quant funds, and I'm like, you people could be like out there solving problems and like not even solving problems, just like attacking problems and creating new observations of these problems that help way more people, that like actually change the world. But instead you want to be behind a desk, like, trading. It's just like, no, come on.
Yeah. And to be fair, for some people, that's like an actual dream. Yeah. And then like, that's what they want to do. But
or they need the money, and like there's reasons for that, right? Like school's expensive. And I mean, let's not even talk about like how expensive tuition is. Yeah. Like that by itself is crazy. Like I feel like, and this is the other thing with AI models, I think, and I was actually talking about this last night with my girlfriend. And it's like, I think the AI models will be actually so much of a competition with the colleges that it will force them to change just by incentive,
Yeah.
because you'll be losing that like tuition revenue, or like you'll be losing the credibility of having the best people coming to you, because people will be like, hey, I can just learn this on my own. I don't need to do this.
Yep.
And there'll be competitive pressure to kind of change.
And so what role do you think universities like MIT will play in the near-term future?
I feel like there'll be some change. I think human memetics doesn't change as quickly, or maybe it could, but like I don't think it has a history of changing very quickly for like large institutions like schools. I mean, they've been around. Like Harvard's been around since what, like 16th, 17th, or hundreds, so 18th, 17th century. And schools, they represent kind of the pinnacle, and especially like think about it, right? If you do a moving average of like over history, we got the internet like in the past like 30 years. Right. So like a majority of information has always just been inside of schools, and like there's been a large societal kind of focus on schools being the source of learning. So I think they will be kind of moved to slow to move. But I mean, especially with the research universities like MIT, I think they will lead, and they're already starting to do some of the stuff. Like I remember in some of the classes they had like very basic AI models talking to you about like how you thought about things or whatever. So I think they're definitely trying. I just think people should be more confident to challenge the status quo and challenge the kind of assumptions that they've held.
Yeah.
And like hopefully like we'll see this like happen in other schools too, and that'll force like Stanford or Caltech or all the other good schools. So like it'll force kind of MIT to be more competitive, which they are good at.
Yeah. And to touch on your other point where you talked about your career fair experiences, there's a bunch of quant firms, there's probably a bunch of SWE firms, or like firms that just have software engineering pipelines, right, through MIT. And something that I've been trying to portray, it's actually part of like my personal mission, is to have people understand that if you're a smart, capable person that's like willing to build, the risk is not as high as what it used to be. Like you can go out there, build with your best friends. Dave always says this, go build with your best friends. And if you're smart, capable people, you're going to produce value, right? Like I saw a stat a couple years ago, I wonder what it is today, that's like Google makes around 15 million in profit per software engineer that they hire. And that's like straight out of university, you're producing that type of value like for the company. And of course, they'll give you every perk in the world and get comfortable for you because you're not going to spend up to that 15 mil. And so like you take that and then you take, okay, building something that can create value in this whole new sector, or you're creating value within this vertical that people didn't even think about applying AI to. Yeah. Like who knows what type of value that produces.
I think like the value of like let's say like before 2022, like pre-ChatGPT, right? The value of the software engineer was that software engineering was abstract enough on a digital platform, which meant you could iterate fast enough and you could distribute very cheaply, right? So you had a person that could create tools to solve real problems for people very quickly, and these problems could like significantly increase like the efficiency of like workflows within industries, right? And this was like the big thing. So like every software engineer was technically capable of doing that, but it requires like being able to understand like what are the problems, how do I build the right tools, and then how do I iterate over that empirically to then, because you're always approximating, right? How do I iterate over that empirically to then like build a better model so that I can build a better tool and then keep going? So I think now it's going to be more, it's not necessarily about software engineering. It's going to be more like, how do I build a better model of people and then give that work with the right tools to build the right things? And because there's so much competition now, it's going to matter a lot more about like how you understand industries. And also there's going to be like second-rate derivative industries. Like, there was like software engineering tools. There are probably going to be like AI tools for AI tools and things like that. But just like generally, there's going to be a lot more people enabled to do these kinds of things. So it's going to matter a lot less about like, I don't know, like how good you are as a SWE or something. It's going to matter a lot more like, hey, can you understand these people's problems? Can you like talk to people or like just observe that like, hey, these people are doing something that I could make better, and then go and do that as much as like building or whatever.
And that's where I see AI can really help like these entrepreneurial people, these builders, because you're not having to spend, like 24/7 coding. Yeah. You have this opportunity where you can talk to customers, you can talk to people potentially having this issue and build for them. And then now you don't have to have a huge engineering team to go build that out. You could say, okay, that's your problem. let me go build it this weekend.
Yeah.
Right. And then now you're at the stage, like even say I'm in venture capital right now. And a lot of what we're noticing is it's young founders
Right.
because they just kind of have this new viewpoint of the world. They're not stuck in their old like software
Right.
engineering ways. And that group of people is getting fairly well funded right now.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where I start talking about like these risk factors. Even if you're money maxing to a point, if you're capable enough and you have a good enough team, your money maxing move is to go create a company.
And the thing is also, people want to hire people who identify problems and solve them. I think this is like a fundamental, like, good hiring, like, heuristic. So if you are, using your agency in a good way, I think that is actually probably more valuable than just like, being a cog somewhere. Yeah, and the other thing is also, it's like you have to practice the skill of like observing internally and being like aware of what's going on and kind of seeing your own biases and like questioning them, which is also even harder, right? When you're on your own and no one's telling you how to do it. So like if you're able to do that, it's like great, go and do that. Or if you even want to try, right? I think it takes some grit to try. So there's no real loss, I think, to trying. Yeah.
And speaking of opportunity costs in general, I think, working at a big tech firm, what I'm noticing from those people is they're not using the windsurfs, they're not using the cursors. They're so deeply entrenched in their internal tech stacks that they stop, like they lose some of that software engineering magic that they had built throughout like universities or building their own projects and things like that. And then like I almost bucket them into lifer category where they more like, and they'll give you the funds to do it, right? To retire a Googler or a Meta person,
right?
But it's like at what cost?
Right. And the other thing is like you have to realize these people, like when you work as a cog in a lot of places, and it's not like some sort of bleeding edge. Like, even like working at Google, like you get to use some cool tools and like their internal tools and stuff. But like a majority of software companies, right? Like you're building on things that people are already built on. So you're extending something. Right. And then like, it's almost like diminishing marginal returns at a certain point for learning, because like it is much easier to hop into an existing project and like duplicate an existing pattern without really any thought. Re-architecting things is like very like difficult, especially. And like, that's really reserved for like new people or like the really, senior people. And yeah, new people just kind of just go in, they kind of just do what already been done. They're not really like thinking, they're kind of just like doing. So it's like, you actually lose more because other people are practicing and like applying new techniques to building new things, and you're like maintaining stagnancy, which is like it's losing in my opinion.
Yeah.
And like eventually they do move to, and then there's also like recently, since 2017, there's like tax benefits, or there's been a loss of tax benefits for hiring software engineers, like big tech firms, and people will like misattribute these layoffs to like AI. It's like no, it's tax incentive. And if that's the case, then it's like, well, you actually have more of an incentive to like go off and build on your own, rather than like go be a cog somewhere, unless you're that good. And even if you are that good, right? Like the scale can be appetizing, but I also like you have to earn the scale, and you don't just get to be like, I feel like it's very easy to like want scale, but you have to earn the scale through like actually serving people's needs. And once you get to that point, you have that scale, right? Now you also built all the systems before that, right? So you have a very, very good understanding of like the constraints building that system. So I think it's just better to go the independent route, or the smaller company route, at least.
And I think it's like in a similar vein to school. Like I don't want it to seem like we hate everybody that works at big tech.
Hate everyone, no.
It's just kind of giving this viewpoint that I feel like is less portrayed, right? Like I know a lot of people coming in, it's, hey, I want to study computer science. And I don't want to work at a FANG company. Yeah. It's just kind of like that. It's also becoming more in to work at a quant firm, right? It's like one of those two.
I feel like, look, it's good to follow patterns. Like you could also argue that like, being independent, like being, I'm going to be a builder or whatever. It's like, that's also a pattern. I think it's just like you have to assess the actual like endpoint of a lot of these things. And it's like, I feel like, I personally gain a lot of like happiness and like, satisfaction from learning things and like being able to apply the things that I learned and like doing new things. So it's like, I feel like that, like chasing money, like you will always get bored of money. Like maybe, you know, it's something like pretentious or something to say, but like, I feel like there's every time that I thought I could like optimize for money, like I ended up like hating it afterward because it was just like what I was doing was just so boring and I wasn't growing anything. Right. And it's like, and that's probably what money's for, right? It's like it's an incentivization to do things that like, you know, that aren't just like inherently just like interesting maybe. Or they're useful, but they're not necessarily like, you know, interesting. So it just doesn't make sense for me personally. And granted, some people have like other needs, right? Like if you have to like maintain a family and do a bunch of other things, like, you know, it's tough. But if you have the opportunity, I think you should always take it. You should always just push.
And for like younger founders, when there's less people relying on you, I think that it's a unique opportunity in your life to kind of take these risks and put yourself out there. Something that I want to get into is around goal setting, because I think we both like talk about it a decent amount, but I'm curious like what your viewpoint is in terms of like, in my view, I take goals, I almost like reverse engineer my like end state, right? Like in the beginning that used to be, hey, I want to be like a billionaire CEO. Right. And it's like, okay, what do I got to do before then? MIT was a pretty cool option there. Right. Like probably have to found a couple of them. I'm knowledgeable enough of the statistics of startups to know I have to hit a couple. Right. And then some are gonna bound to fail, but you're gonna have one that hits, you make it to another stage, and then you get one that like goes there. Right. That kind of changed. Right. I got really sick. People on my channel know about that. And then it became, okay, what I want to optimize in my life is, you know, experience, time with my family, value that I can give to the world, to other people, like on a personal level like this. And then that became, okay, so what do I need to do to go there, right? I'm like, okay, I'll double down on my YouTube channel because I have a lot of reach. I'll like VC became really interesting because I get to mentor a lot of these young founders, and it's like, yes, I get to sit on their boards and like boss them around, but I get to like more so
you get to interact with
them,
company,
help them like not make some of the bad mistakes that I've made in my life, and kind of guide them in a way that just fulfills me. And then what I'm realizing in this whole process is like, even when that focus shifted, like the money's still coming, right? Like the notoriety still stays, and I think it's because of the fact that I'm just kind of living my life genuinely, and you're going after these goals, and the other stuff will follow.
I think the one thing you have to accept is that it's always going to change, and your understanding of the world changes, and therefore like eventually your goals must, right? Because your goals were made in a setting where you didn't know things. I think that's one of the big principles that drives like how I assign my goals now. I think what I do around my goals is I work on like compounding achievability, right? So it's like, if I want to do something, I want to do a very simple, small version of it first. And then I would like, by doing this thing, and if I can complete that thing, then it's almost like a binary decision, right? It's like, if I complete the thing, it's like, great, then I do something harder. And then if I miscalculated and I made that, simple thing much harder, then I like break that down into smaller things now that I've tried to do something and I understand it better. And this is about like, it's like empirical, like analysis and observation, and then iteration is basically how I view it. So like, for example, I know we're going to talk about this in a bit, but like Howard, I thought it was going to be really easy at first, and I was like, cool.
And Howard is
the beast downstairs in the Link data center. And yeah, so it's like, as a server. So like at first I was like, cool, this is going to be like really quick. I'm going to buy a used server. I'm going to toss and there's a bunch of complications, right? And like within those complications, I learned about things, and there was like highs and lows, and there was times where I thought it was going to fail, and there was times where I thought, oh, it's going to work out perfectly, and like it ended up somewhere between there. So yeah, it's more of like, and also I think you get better at like realizing what things are based off things you're very confident on, and what things you don't really know, and then you also learn how to like figure out what things you can answer ahead of time. And this is like I've always kind of been very quick to kind of like jump in and do things, but there is a benefit to doing some preliminary research, and like, read through things, see what other people have done. That's another big thing, where it's like, if you can almost, a really, really good first step, I think, for a lot of things is just like copy something someone else has done, like step by step, and just like immerse yourself in the process. And then the next really good thing is just like take one thing about it and just like change it the way like and pick something that you want to change and just change that. And that's like a really great first step, because it's like first you figure out this like the thing that you're trying to do. You have a working version of it that you have like probably like debugged a little bit or like tinkered around with and got like a working version up on. And then you can take that and then actually go and apply changes, which like confirm that, hey, I understand what I'm doing enough to make a change on it. And if you're able to make that change, then it's like, great, let's make another one. And then maybe you want, at some point, you want to restart from scratch after you've learned enough of like what the problems of that initial setup were. And that's kind of how I've done a lot of things generally. And I think in life generally, like big term, like yeah, everyone wanted to be Tony Stark. And I mean, like one of the reasons I went to MIT was because of Tony Stark, you know? But I also think that like you will never be Tony Stark, and that is not a bad thing, right? Because Tony Stark lived in a different way and had like different life experiences. So you would just be you. And accepting that, I think, is almost like letting go of the expectation of the, you know, result, and more, I think, of enjoying the process of becoming Tony Stark. So it's like, you know, it is not bad to romanticize your life a little bit and kind of like enjoy what's going on. And like, you know, enjoy your wins and then take your losses. You know, it's fun, I think.
Okay, so I want to leave time so that we can go down and look at Howard and
Right.
talk a little bit more about it. There's a couple questions that I ask all the founders that come in here.
For sure.
One of them is outside of building.
Yes.
What do you do for fun?
So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I like reading and podcasts. Been especially like in my free time between like what on the commute or like when I'm walking around and things like that. I like listening to like different kinds of podcasts about, you know, geopolitics, history, whatever. Like it varies by the time. Or like, reading books about, you know, reading biographies. I like reading biographies a lot. It has to do kind of with that romanticism sort of thing where it's like, I think it is interesting to view someone's entire life in context, because you can kind of see like every single interesting. And we were talking about Steve Jobs earlier, right? It was like Steve Jobs was like a young kid getting like spare parts from the HP CEO and then working at Atari and like doing all these like crazy things, like going to India and like all these like wild things, right? And he had like a full life. Like he wasn't just like, you know, he woke up one day and he became like a billionaire. And I think it is important to view people's lives in context, because it makes you appreciate your own life. Because you kind of like, I mean, personally, like I look at my life kind of like as a biography in the making, right? And I'm enjoying what's happening. I'm like, oh, that was a cool, like I would definitely include that, you know, in my like life story. So like I really enjoy doing that. I like spending time with like, I have a girlfriend, spend time with her. Yeah, I mean, I like working.
Yeah, no,
I like working. I like reading the papers and stuff. I don't know. I like to focus on a lot what I'm doing. So like I spend a lot of my free time around like doing low stress things that like contribute to that. I'm on Twitter, I like on or X.com, you know.
Yeah.
I like scrolling on X.com. I have a bunch of friends on X. Shout out members only, you know who you are. But yeah. I mean, it's kind of boring. You know?
No, I mean, it's chill.
But yeah, I don't know. Shoot, I like watching TV sometimes. This is actually something that's very underrated, I think, recently. So my girlfriend put me on to like a bunch of these TV shows like South Park. And I feel like people don't understand how like what South Park and like all these like little stupid TV shows that people produce, like they're really like trying to talk about like the problems at the time. And, like if you focus very clearly, like they're talking about very clear issues. And I think that like when people like look back at history and they're talking about like, oh, these people writing speeches or like whatever, right? It's like that is like the medium of the time that people like communicate memetics through, right? And it's like TV is like a very big way of doing this now. So I think you get a very good like grasp of like the problems people like talk about and like care about at the time, and like it's almost a form of like a looking glass to like modern history by looking at these shows and stuff. So yeah, I do like try to spend time looking through that stuff, you know, when I can, not too much, but you know.
Yeah, and I'll expose myself a little bit in terms of my fiance and I love watching Love Island.
Oh, Love Island is great.
And
Love Island
and
USA.
for me,
yeah,
like it's a big thing of just understanding how people think.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like it, regardless of what's happening,
Right,
backdrop,
right.
the weird challenges, or
Right,
whatever,
right,
it's
right.
like, I think they're about to do this in that situation,
right.
and they either do it or they don't,
Right,
and it's
right.
like, why not?
Yeah.
Right? And then I have like this whole like human philosophy that I get to start thinking about.
It's important. And the crazy thing is like I think it's also funny to like see, because like especially for like Love Island, right? It's interactive. So you see people like interacting and like voting and all this stuff, and it's like it's really interesting because it's like this is what people do in their free time. This is what people do for fun nowadays. I feel like it's like it's historical aspect. I mean, maybe it's because like I like reading history a lot or something, but it like it reflects on the values of the civilization at the time.
Yeah.
And like I think in like 1,000 years or something, when people look back at what we're doing now, they're going to look at like shows like Love Island, and they're going to be like historical buffs that are like very, very well versed in like all the Love Island episodes because like they have access to it the same way people are like Shakespeare buffs or something. So who knows if Love Island will be like compared to like
Yeah.
Probably not, but
And that's the reason why I also like we're gonna do a live stream coming up, because I want that to be interactive.
Right.
I think in a world of AI, a lot of things are generated. And people are still gravitating towards that. Hey, like putting something in chat, getting it to be responded. So tune into those live streams when those happen.
All right.
And so one last question is, what's your favorite AI tool right now?
Gemini. Oh, I'm a Gemini man. I'm a Gemini through and through. I use Gemini for everything. ChatGPT fell off. Clout is dog water.
So when you say Gemini for everything, give me some use case.
So I use Gemini Pro. So I use Gemini Pro in general is like my go-to model for question asking in general. I have like all my.
And right now it's on 2.5.
2.5 Pro. Yeah. The GOAT. Gemini Diffusion also came out. I got access to that. That was pretty cool. Google. I very much believe in Google because they are the only real AI company that has been fully integrated from the ground up in AI. So if they have, their products, they have their models, they have their chips, they have their own data centers. They've been kind of thinking about this very vertically, and I like the I feel like you have to put everything into context to build good systems. So they have that. So yeah, there's that. And the TPU is a work of art. Like you got to appreciate the TPU, even though they cap about flops. And we're talking about you, Ironwood. But yeah, so Gemini Pro for general question asking, any sort of like when I'm breaking down papers and things like that, Gemini Pro. I also like the feature that I discovered recently was like Canvas lets you build websites really well. So like I like setting up papers, and I'll just like dump them into Gemini, get a full like deep understanding of them, and then I'll have it like make a website about the paper so that I can kind of like go through it non-linearly. Like you're not supposed to, this is the thing also that I learned recently in the past like couple months, is that like you don't just like read a paper. Like you have like even the best paper readers, they don't just like sit and like chunk through it, right? They kind of go through, they skim through, they find all the important parts, and then they kind of like distill. So I figured out like ways to like get like the visuals from like archive and like load them in and like get all this stuff to the model so that it can go and like make it like a non-linear thing that I can kind of skim through really easily and then go and read the paper, and then I can ask questions about that in the chat about like certain aspects, like once I've actually like I know the general direction of the paper. Maybe I don't want to read the paper, maybe I do. And then deep research in Gemini is just goated because of just like I use deep research to collect information. I kind of use it as a big like net to filter stuff. So like for example, like I was trying to like find a bunch of like relevant programming models to like Howard's chips to kind of figure out like, okay, what is the kind of like industry standard or like general practices of like organizing programming across these chips. It's called data flow programming. So like I spent like a couple days like iterating over prompts, like find me a certain type of like certain types of compute chips with these characteristics that are similar to this, focus on these specific types of like, heterogeneous compute, communicating over a network on chip, etc. All these ideas. And then like, okay, deep research, go and find me things like this. And I would iterate on it until I found a set of like papers, textbooks, whatever that talked about things that I wanted. And now I have like a kind of big net of ideas I can kind of like more finely like focus on. And obviously I'm going to like read, with deep research or like a pro, and I'm going to ask questions about it. But like it searches like thousands of websites at a time. So right, it's just very efficient. And it's also say Google based, right? So they have the Google backend and stuff. That's like really important.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's basically how I use AI tools.
Cool.
For the most part. Yeah. And Cursor. Cursor is goated, yeah. Cursor is goated also because like you can add, like I work with a lot of like very like C++ heavy like mono repos. So it is very cool to have like Cursor just like go through this code base and like find things and like make connections for ideas for me. It's an important skill to do, but like it'll do it faster, and I can kind of work on multiple things in parallel while it's going to do.
Are you someone that changes models depending on your task, or you're all Gemini Pro?
No, I change models depending on so what I'll do is like I'll use their like auto kind of selection feature, until like it's just like not satisfying my constraints, and then I'll switch to something and I'll test around. It's just being empirical, but I think Gemini in general is like a great model. I don't use it for coding as much.
Gotcha.
Like for a lot of the coding stuff, I'll just like write something and then I'll have something else implement, like maybe optimize or something. I have a buddy who's actually working on using different Gemini models to like iterate and like improve programs to like map elites and like all these different things from like AlphaVolve, the recent Google project. So maybe do something like that soon.
Cool. Sounds good.
All right.
Okay. So this is going to be our time here.
All right,
But
bet.
we'll continue the
Sounds good.
conversation
Thanks
out
for
in the
having me.
studio.
All right.